Close your eyes and listen. In the high desert of northern New Mexico, beneath skies so vast they seem to curve at the edges, there exists a sound that refuses to be silent. It's low, persistent, a vibrational hum that seems to emanate from the earth itself. Most people hear nothing but wind through pinyon pines and the distant call of ravens. But for some, a small percentage of the population in and around the town of Taos, there is something else. Something that never stops. This is Taos, elevation 7,000 feet, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rise like ancient sentinels to the east, and the Rio Grande Gorge cuts a 700-foot wound through volcanic rock to the west. It's a place where cultures layer upon one another like sedimentary stone. The Taos Pueblo, continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years, stands just north of the modern plaza. Adobe walls hold centuries of prayers and stories. Spanish colonists arrived in the 1500s, bringing their own gods and architecture. In the early 1900s, artists discovered the quality of light here, that crystalline high desert radiance that makes every shadow sharp and every color impossibly vivid. Georgia O'Keeffe country, they call it. A landscape of juniper and sage, a vast emptiness that somehow feels crowded with presence. And then, there are the installations. Los Alamos National Laboratory lies 60 miles to the southwest, birthplace of the atomic age. The Taos area itself has seen military activity, radar installations, experimental facilities whose purposes remain classified. This convergence of the ancient, the artistic, and the clandestine creates a peculiar energy, a sense that this high desert plateau is a place where realities overlap. It was in the early 1990s when residents began reporting the hum. Not everyone heard it. That's the crucial detail that transforms this from simple noise pollution into genuine mystery. In a town of roughly 6,000 people, perhaps 50 to 100 individuals, maybe 2% of the population, describe the same phenomenon. A low-frequency drone, like a distant diesel engine idling, thrumming beneath the threshold of normal hearing. Some described it as a vibration felt as much as heard. It was worse indoors, worse at night, worse in quiet moments when the world should be still. For those who heard it, the hum became a kind of torture. Imagine a sound you cannot escape, cannot identify, cannot prove to others. Your spouse hears nothing. Your neighbors think you're imagining things. You drive into the desert, seeking silence, and still it follows. That deep subsonic pulse resonating in your chest cavity, in your skull. Some people left Taos entirely, driven away by a sound most residents insisted didn't exist. Others suffered through sleepless nights, anxiety, a creeping sense of isolation that comes from perceiving something the world tells you isn't there. The scientific community took notice. In 1993, a team of researchers funded by various organizations descended on Taos to investigate. They brought sophisticated acoustic equipment, seismographs, instruments capable of detecting frequencies well below the range of human hearing. They interviewed hearers, mapped locations, measured, and analyzed. Their conclusion was both validating and frustrating. Yes, many residents were genuinely experiencing something. No, the instruments could not definitively identify a source. Various local sources of sound and vibration were ruled out. Industrial facilities, power lines, atmospheric phenomena, all were investigated and eliminated as primary causes. The mystery deepened. This is where the Taos hum becomes more than an acoustic puzzle. It becomes a story about the nature of perception itself, about the invisible dividing line between those who experience the world one way and those who experience it another. The hearers formed a community of sorts, united by shared suffering and shared validation. Support groups emerged. People compared notes, searching for patterns. Were hearers more likely to be women than men? Did age play a role? What about sensitivity to other environmental factors? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. And threading through all of this is the desert itself, that high, arid landscape of Chamisa and Chala, where silence is supposed to be profound. Where artists come to escape the noise of civilization. Where Pueblo peoples have maintained spiritual practices tied to the earth, the sky, the rhythms of seasons. Into this landscape of sought-after quiet comes an unwanted sound, uninvited, and unexplained. This is not a story about conspiracy theories or alien visitations, though those narratives have certainly attached themselves to the phenomenon. This is a story about human beings trying to make sense of their own perceptions, trying to find validation for experiences that exist at the margins of what our instruments can measure and what our neighbors can confirm. It's about the loneliness of sensing something real that remains invisible to most. And it's about a place, this high desert convergence point, where the ordinary and the inexplicable exist side by side beneath that endless New Mexico sky. The hum continues. Decades later, some still hear it. The investigations have quieted, but the sound has not. What follows is an exploration of this mystery, layer by layer, from the subjective experiences of hearers to the objective attempts of science, from the acoustic properties of low-frequency sound to the psychological toll of chronic unexplained phenomena. We will walk the high desert roads, listen to the testimonies, examine the evidence, and sit with the questions that resist easy answers. Because some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly. Some invite us to listen more carefully, to question our assumptions about perception and reality, and to remember that the world contains more than what most of us can hear. Katie first heard the hum on a Thursday evening in October of 1993, while sitting in her favorite reading chair near the adobe fireplace of her Taos home. She had lived in this house for 6 years, knew every creak of its wooden beams, every whisper of wind through the cottonwoods outside. But this sound was different, unfamiliar, persistent. At first, she thought it was something mechanical, perhaps the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, or maybe the furnace preparing for the coming winter chill. She set down her book, tilted her head slightly, trying to locate the source of what she would later describe as a low, droning vibration that seemed to pulse through the evening air. The sound had a particular quality to it, something that defied easy description. When she would later try to explain it to her husband, to her neighbors, to the doctor she eventually consulted about her insomnia, she would say it was like a diesel truck idling somewhere in the distance, perhaps a block or two away, never quite arriving, never quite departing. But that comparison never felt quite accurate. Diesel engines have a mechanical clarity to them, a rhythm you can predict. This sound was less defined, more omnipresent, as though the air itself had developed a frequency all its own. Katie stood up from her chair and walked through the house, checking each room methodically. In the kitchen, she pressed her ear against the refrigerator, listening to its familiar hum. Not the same. She checked the gas furnace in the hallway closet, placed her hand against its metal housing. Silent and cool. She walked to the bathroom, wondering if perhaps a pipe was vibrating somewhere in the walls, but the plumbing was quiet. She even went outside through the back door into the cool October darkness, thinking perhaps a neighbor had left a car running or was using some kind of generator. But standing in her backyard under the vast New Mexico sky, the sound seemed to intensify rather than diminish, resonating through her body in a way that made her profoundly uncomfortable. This physical sensation would become one of the most disturbing aspects of her experience with the hum. It was not simply something she heard with her ears. The sound seemed to vibrate in her chest cavity, as though her rib cage had become a resonating chamber for this inexplicable frequency. Sometimes she felt it more in her left ear than her right. Sometimes it seemed to pulse behind her eyes. The sensation was maddening in its inconsistency, in the way it seemed to defy the normal rules of how sound should behave. When her husband Michael came home from his evening shift at the art gallery, she met him at the door with a question that would become increasingly familiar over the coming weeks and months. "Can you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, setting down his keys on the table by the entrance. "That sound," she said, "that low humming sound. It has been going on for hours." Michael stood in the hallway, his head tilted in the same way hers had been earlier, genuinely trying to perceive whatever was troubling his wife. He heard nothing unusual. The house was quiet, peaceful even. He heard the wind moving through the trees outside, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood, but no hum, no drone, no vibration. Katie felt a twist of frustration in her stomach. How could he not hear it? It was so present, so undeniable to her senses. She led him from room to room, asking again and again if he could perceive the sound. In the bedroom, in the living room, outside on the portal, she asked him to listen carefully, to really focus. Michael tried, standing perfectly still, holding his breath, straining to hear whatever frequency was tormenting his wife. But there was nothing. The look in his eyes gradually shifted from concern to a kind of gentle skepticism that Katie found almost worse than his inability to hear the sound. She could see him beginning to wonder if perhaps the problem was not in the house, but in her. That night, Katie barely slept. The hum seemed to intensify in the darkness, growing louder as the ambient sounds of the day faded away. Lying in bed next to her softly snoring husband, she felt utterly alone. The vibration seemed to pulse through the mattress, through the adobe walls, through the very foundations of the house. She tried earplugs, pressing them deep into her ear canals, but the hum seemed to bypass her ears entirely, resonating through the bones of her skull. She tried covering her head with a pillow, but the muffled darkness only made the sensation more claustrophobic, more inescapable. At 3 a.m, she got up and went to the living room, thinking perhaps distance from the bedroom would help. She lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark ceiling beams. The hum continued, relentless and maddening. She found herself crying without quite knowing why, tears of exhaustion and frustration sliding down her temples into her hair. What was wrong with her? Why could she hear this sound when no one else could? Was she losing her mind? The following days brought no relief, only a deepening sense of isolation. Katie began asking neighbors if they heard anything unusual. Mrs. Sanchez next door looked at her with polite confusion. Mr. Martinez across the street suggested perhaps she was hearing traffic from the highway, though the main road was more than a mile away. The couple who ran the small gallery down the street smiled sympathetically and said they heard nothing out of the ordinary. With each conversation, Katie felt herself becoming smaller, less credible, more alone in her experience. The hum followed patterns that she began to track obsessively in a small notebook. It was worse at night, particularly between the hours of 10 in the evening and 4 in the morning. It seemed to intensify during certain weather conditions, particularly on still, clear nights when the air was dry and cold. Some mornings she would wake, exhausted from another sleepless night, and the sound would be barely perceptible, a faint vibration at the edge of awareness. On those mornings, she felt a surge of hope that perhaps it had stopped, that whatever malfunction in her perception or in the environment had resolved itself. But by evening, the hum would return, settling over her like a heavy blanket she could not remove. Her work began to suffer. Katie was a freelance graphic designer, working from a small studio she had set up in the spare bedroom of their adobe home. But concentration became nearly impossible. The constant vibration, the persistent drone, fragmented her attention. She would sit at her computer, trying to focus on color palettes and layout designs, but the hum would intrude on every thought, every creative impulse. Projects that should have taken hours stretched into days. Deadlines began to slip. Clients started to complain. Michael grew increasingly concerned as he watched his wife deteriorate under the weight of this invisible burden. He suggested she see a doctor, perhaps get her hearing tested, rule out any medical causes. Katie agreed, desperate for any explanation, any solution. The audiologist in Santa Fe ran a complete battery of tests, checking her hearing at various frequencies, looking for damage or abnormalities. Everything came back normal. Her hearing was fine, perhaps even slightly better than average for her age of 38 years. The doctor suggested stress, perhaps anxiety, and wrote a prescription for sleeping pills. Katie filled the prescription, but found that even medicated sleep did not silence the hum. It followed her into her dreams, a constant background vibration that colored every sleeping thought. The only relief came when she left Taos entirely. On a Saturday in November, she and Michael drove to Albuquerque for the day, running errands and visiting friends. As they descended from the high plateau where Taos sat, dropping down into the Rio Grande Valley, Katie felt the hum gradually diminish. By the time they reached the city, it was gone completely. The silence was so profound, so blessed, that she nearly wept with relief. For those few hours in Albuquerque, she felt like herself again, free from the constant vibration that had become the soundtrack of her existence. But the return journey brought the hum back with cruel predictability. As they climbed back up toward Taos, ascending into the high desert landscape she had once loved so deeply, Katie felt the vibration beginning again. First faint, then stronger, then overwhelming. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the hum was as loud as it had ever been, resonating through her chest, pulsing behind her eyes. She sat in the passenger seat for a long moment after Michael turned off the engine, staring at their home, the adobe walls glowing amber in the setting sun, and felt a wave of despair so complete it took her breath away. This place she had chosen, this life she had built, had become a prison of sound that only she could hear. Michael reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. His face showed love and concern, but also a helplessness that mirrored her own. How do you fight something that only one person can perceive? How do you solve a problem that may not even exist outside the boundaries of a single human nervous system? Katie squeezed back, then opened the car door and stepped out into the evening air. The hum welcomed her home like a malevolent spirit that had been waiting patiently for her return. In the spring of 1993, Janet Eaton sat alone at her kitchen table in Taos, New Mexico, wondering if she was losing her mind. The retired elementary school teacher had spent 32 years instructing children in reading and mathematics, priding herself on her rationality and patience. But for the past 6 months, she had been hearing something that defied explanation. A low-frequency hum, persistent and relentless, seemed to vibrate through the walls of her adobe home on the outskirts of town. It was loudest at night, when the world grew quiet and the sound became impossible to ignore. She described it later as similar to a diesel truck idling in the distance. But when she walked outside, there was never any truck. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Janet tried everything she could think of. She checked her furnace, her water heater, every appliance in her home. She called the gas company, convinced there must be a leak or some mechanical issue. They found nothing. She consulted an audiologist in Santa Fe, who tested her hearing and found it perfectly normal for a woman of 63. The doctor suggested tinnitus, but Janet knew better. Tinnitus was a ringing in the ears. This was different. This came from outside, from the earth itself, or so it seemed. She began sleeping in the guest bedroom, then moved to the living room couch, searching for some corner of her house where the sound might be less intense. There was no escape. What Janet did not know, as she struggled through those sleepless nights, was that less than 3 miles away, Thomas Whitehorse was experiencing the exact same phenomenon. Thomas worked construction, spending his days framing houses and pouring foundations throughout Taos County. He was 41 years old, in excellent health, and had never had problems sleeping in his life. But starting in late 1992, something changed. He would come home exhausted from 10 hours of physical labor, collapse into bed, and then lie awake for hours, listening to what he later described as a throbbing, pulsing sound that seemed to emanate from deep underground. Unlike Janet, who heard a steady hum, Thomas perceived variations in the sound. It would rise and fall slightly, like breathing, like something alive beneath the desert floor. Thomas told his wife about it first, and she looked at him with concern, but heard nothing herself. He mentioned it to coworkers, who laughed and suggested he lay off the beer. Embarrassed, he stopped talking about it. Instead, he started sleeping in his truck, parked in different locations around Taos, searching for somewhere the sound could not reach him. Sometimes, in certain spots, it seemed quieter. Other times, it followed him no matter where he went. He began to dread sunset, knowing that darkness would bring the hum and with it, another night of fragmented, insufficient sleep. Meanwhile, across town in the Arts District, painter Michelle Brennan was documenting her experience in a series of increasingly agitated journal entries. Michelle had moved to Taos in 1989, drawn by the town's legendary artistic community and the stark beauty of the high desert landscape. She was 36, successful enough to make a living from her work and deeply attuned to her environment. Her paintings reflected the subtle color shifts of the New Mexico sky, the way light transformed the Sangre de Cristo Mountains throughout the day. So when the hum began in her awareness sometime in early 1993, she noticed it immediately and intensely. Michelle's description differed from both Janet's and Thomas's accounts. She heard what she called a mechanical thrumming, as if a massive generator were running somewhere just beyond perception. The pitch was low enough that she felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. It interfered with her work. She found herself unable to concentrate, unable to access the meditative state she relied upon for painting. She started drinking more wine in the evenings, hoping it would help her sleep. It did not. She purchased a white noise machine from a catalog, a device that generated sounds of rainfall and ocean waves. The machine helped marginally, but she could still detect the hum beneath the artificial noise, persistent and maddening. The breakthrough came in August of 1993, when Janet Eaton made a decision that would change everything for the hearers of Taos. Frustrated beyond measure and convinced that she could not be the only person experiencing this phenomenon, she wrote a letter to the Taos News, the local weekly newspaper. In carefully composed sentences, she described the sound, acknowledged how strange her complaint might seem, and asked a simple question: was anyone else hearing this? The letter appeared in the August 19th edition. Within a week, the newspaper received 43 phone calls and 17 additional letters. People emerged from their private suffering, relieved and amazed to discover they were not alone. Thomas Whitehorse called the newspaper office and left his contact information. Michelle Brennan did the same. By early September, a core group of 12 individuals had connected with one another and scheduled a meeting at the Dallas Public Library. That first gathering took place on a Tuesday evening, September 14, 1993. 27 people showed up, far more than the organizers expected. They represented a cross-section of Taos, retirees and young adults, artists and tradespeople, longtime residents and recent arrivals. What united them was the sound that no one else seemed to hear. For many in that room, the meeting represented the first validation they had received, the first evidence that they were not suffering from delusion or mental illness. Janet Eaton facilitated the initial discussion, and what emerged was both reassuring and deeply puzzling. Every person in that library meeting room heard something, but the descriptions varied in subtle and sometimes significant ways. Most perceived a low-frequency hum or drone. Some, like Thomas, detected pulsations or rhythmic variations. Others heard it as a pure tone, unchanging and constant. A few reported that the sound was louder indoors than outdoors. Others experienced the opposite. Several people noted that the hum seemed to intensify at night, though whether this was due to actual changes in the sound or simply the absence of ambient daytime noise remained unclear. They compared notes on coping mechanisms. One woman, a nurse at Holy Cross Hospital, had been sleeping in her car 3 nights a week, driving to different locations until she found spots where the hum seemed less intense. A retired engineer had constructed a soundproofed room in his basement, lining the walls with foam and insulation, only to find that the hum penetrated anyway. Multiple people reported using fans, white noise machines, or even running water to mask the sound. Some had resorted to sleeping pills or alcohol. A few had considered leaving Taos altogether, abandoning homes and lives because of a sound most people could not hear. The group decided to organize more formally. They called themselves the Taos Hum Hearers, acknowledging the term that was already circulating in the local community. They elected Janet as their spokesperson and began documenting their experiences in systematic detail. They created questionnaires, gathering data on when people first noticed the sound, where it seemed loudest, what time of day it was most noticeable, and what physical or psychological effects it produced. They were determined to approach this mystery methodically, to prove that something real was occurring, even if they did not yet understand what it was. In October of 1993, the group contacted local television stations in Albuquerque. A reporter from Coat TV drove to Taos and interviewed several hearers. The segment aired on the evening news, bringing regional attention to the phenomenon. This marked a turning point. Suddenly, the Taos hum was no longer a private suffering or a local curiosity. It became a news story, something that demanded response from authorities. The hearers approached the Taos County Commission, requesting an official investigation. They wanted measurements taken, experts consulted, possibilities explored. The commission reacted with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. Some officials took the complaint seriously, recognizing that dozens of citizens were reporting genuine distress. Others dismissed the hearers as cranks or attention seekers, suggesting mass hysteria or psychosomatic illness. The division reflected a broader split in the community. Roughly 2% of Taos residents reported hearing the hummed whine. The other 98% heard nothing at all. This created a strange social dynamic. Hearers often felt isolated even among friends and family. Spouses slept peacefully while hearers lay awake, tormented by a sound that seemed to exist only for them. The inability of the majority to perceive the hum led some to question the sanity or honesty of those who reported it. Hearers faced subtle and sometimes overt skepticism. Are you sure it is not just tinnitus? Maybe you need to see a therapist. Perhaps you are too stressed. The implications were clear. The problem was not environmental but personal, not real but imagined. Yet the hearers knew what they experienced. The validation of finding others who shared their perception was profound. Michelle Brennan later described the first meeting as one of the most important evenings of her life. For months, she had felt increasingly isolated, wondering if she was experiencing some form of breakdown. Discovering that dozens of others heard the same sound, that their descriptions aligned with her own experience, restored her sense of reality. She was not crazy. Something was actually happening. The group grew. By November of 1993, more than 80 Taos residents had identified themselves as hearers. They continued to meet monthly, sharing information and supporting one another. Some members became amateur investigators, researching possible sources of low-frequency sound. They considered industrial facilities, military installations, geological factors, atmospheric conditions. Taos sits at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet, surrounded by mountains and situated along geological fault lines. Could seismic activity generate low-frequency vibrations? Could atmospheric pressure changes in the high desert create acoustic effect? Thomas Whitehorse began keeping a detailed log, noting the intensity of the hum on a scale of 1 to 10 each night, along with weather conditions, his physical state, and his location. Over time, he noticed that the sound seemed worse on certain nights, though he could not identify a clear pattern. Janet Eaton started corresponding with researchers who studied acoustic phenomena, searching for scientific explanations. Michelle Brennan created a series of paintings, attempting to visualize the sound, translating her auditory torment into visual form. By early 1994, the Taos Hum had attracted national media attention. Journalists from major newspapers visited the town. Television crews arrived to document the mystery. Scientists from the University of New Mexico conducted preliminary studies, using sensitive equipment to measure sound levels at various locations throughout Taos. They detected nothing unusual, no low-frequency sound that might account for what the hearers described. This negative finding did not reassure the hearers. It simply deepened the mystery, and for some skeptics, confirmed their belief that nothing real was occurring. But something was occurring. Too many credible people, from too many different backgrounds, with too much consistency in their reports, were describing the same basic phenomenon. The Taos Hum was real, even if its source remained unknown. The community of hearers continued to grow, bound together by shared experience and shared frustration, searching for answers to a question that seemed to resist all conventional investigation. In the desert night, while the majority of Taos slept in peace, the hearers lay awake, listening to a sound that would not stop. By the spring of 1993, the residents of Taos who heard the hum had reached their breaking point. For years, they had been dismissed, patronized, and quietly ridiculed. They had endured sleepless nights, mounting stress, and the creeping isolation that comes when your suffering remains invisible to others. But they had also organized, written letters, and made enough noise of their own that finally, someone with authority was listening. The University of New Mexico, in collaboration with other institutions, agreed to conduct a formal scientific investigation. For the hearers of Taos, this was everything they had been fighting for. Validation seemed just beyond the horizon, a tangible promise that their torment would soon be named, measured, and ultimately silenced. The announcement came through official channels. A team of researchers, led by acoustical experts and supported by medical professionals, would descend on Taos with equipment sensitive enough to detect sounds far below the threshold of normal human hearing. The methodology was rigorous, the credentials impressive. This was not some weekend enthusiast with a tape recorder. This was peer-reviewed science, funded and formal, the kind of investigation that produced papers and conclusions, and, most importantly, answers. The hearers felt a collective exhale, a release of tension they had carried for so long. It had become part of their physiology. Finally, someone would prove what they already knew. The hum was real. The team arrived in late spring when the high desert air was clear and sharp. They brought with them an arsenal of sophisticated instruments. Sensitive microphones capable of capturing infrasound, those frequencies below 20 Hz that human ears typically cannot process, but that the body might still perceive. Spectrum analyzers to break down the acoustic environment into its component parts. Calibrated equipment that could measure sound pressure levels with scientific precision. They set up monitoring stations throughout Taos, placing their instruments in the homes of hearers, in quiet outdoor locations, in basements and attics and open fields. The goal was comprehensive coverage, a complete acoustic map of the town and its surroundings. The methodology extended beyond mere measurement. The researchers conducted extensive interviews, sitting down with hearers and non-hearers alike. They wanted to understand the subjective experience, to catalog the variations and consistencies in how people described what they perceived. Some hearers spoke of a low-frequency rumble, like a diesel engine idling in the distance. Others described it as a drone, a vibration more felt than heard. A few compared it to the resonance of electrical transformers or the distant thrum of industrial machinery. The descriptions varied, but certain patterns emerged. Most hearers reported that the sound was worse indoors, particularly at night. Many said it seemed to come from no particular direction, or from everywhere at once. Nearly all described the psychological toll, the way the relentless presence of the hum had invaded their peace and stolen their rest. The non-hearers were equally important to the study. The researchers needed to understand why some people in Taos were tormented while their neighbors heard nothing at all. They interviewed spouses who slept soundly beside partners who lay awake in agony. They spoke with longtime residents who had never perceived anything unusual, newcomers who claimed they heard the hum within days of arrival. The divide was sharp and seemingly arbitrary. Age did not predict it. Gender did not predict it. Proximity to industrial sites or power lines showed no correlation. The hum, it seemed, was maddeningly selective in whom it chose to afflict. Medical examinations followed the interviews. The researchers wanted to rule out the possibility that hearers were suffering from tinnitus or other auditory conditions that might produce phantom sounds. Hearers underwent hearing tests, audiological evaluations, and physical examinations. The results were unremarkable. The hearers possessed normal hearing, no different from the general population. There were no consistent abnormalities, no medical red flags that might explain their shared experience. If anything, the medical data only deepened the puzzle. These were ordinary people with ordinary ears reporting an extraordinary phenomenon. As the weeks passed, anticipation built to an almost unbearable pitch. The hearers watched the researchers move through town with their equipment, taking readings, recording data, filling notebooks with observations. They answered questions patiently, submitted to tests willingly, and waited. The waiting was excruciating in its own way, but it was threaded through with hope. For the first time, their experience was being taken seriously. Scientists were listening, measuring, documenting. The validation they craved seemed inevitable. Soon, the researchers would hold a press conference and announce their findings. They would point to graphs and data tables and declare that yes, there is an anomalous sound in Taos, and here is its source. The hearers imagined that moment with desperate longing. The researchers maintained professional detachment throughout, offering no premature conclusions, no hints about what the data might reveal. They were thorough and methodical, extending their stay to ensure comprehensive coverage. They returned to certain locations multiple times, cross-checking their readings, eliminating variables. The hearers interpreted this diligence as a good sign. Surely the scientists were being so careful because they had found something significant, something that required precise verification before it could be announced. Then came the results. In the autumn of 1993, the University of New Mexico team released their findings. The report was detailed, carefully worded, and utterly devastating to the hearers of Taos. After months of investigation, thousands of hours of acoustic monitoring, and exhaustive analysis, the conclusion was stark and unequivocal. No external sound source could be identified that correlated with the reports from hearers. The sensitive equipment had detected various ambient sounds, the normal acoustic background of a small town surrounded by high desert. There were occasional low-frequency sounds from traffic, from wind, from distant aircraft. But nothing persistent, nothing unusual, and crucially, nothing that aligned with when and where hearers reported perceiving the hum. The report did offer one concession. The researchers explicitly stated that the hearers were sincere. They were not fabricating their experiences. They were not seeking attention or engaging in mass hysteria. The medical examinations and interviews had made clear that these individuals were genuinely distressed, genuinely suffering. But the suffering, according to the data, had no identifiable external acoustic cause. The hum, as measured by the best equipment available, did not exist. The reaction from the hearers was swift and anguished. Many felt betrayed. They had opened their homes and their lives to these researchers. They had trusted that science would vindicate them, would finally give name and form to their invisible tormentor. Instead, they felt dismissed all over again, but this time with the weight of scientific authority behind the dismissal. Some hearers expressed frustration that bordered on rage. How could the researchers spend months in Taos and hear nothing when the hum was right there, constant and maddening? Others fell into confusion and self-doubt. If the instruments detected nothing, did that mean they were imagining it after all? The psychological impact was profound. The investigation, which was supposed to bring relief, had instead compounded their distress. A smaller group of hearers rejected the findings outright. They insisted the equipment must have been inadequate or improperly calibrated. Perhaps the hum existed at a frequency, or in a form that current technology could not measure. Perhaps it was not a sound in the conventional sense but something else entirely, a vibration, an electromagnetic phenomenon, something science had not yet learned to detect. These hearers clung to their conviction that the hum was real and external, refusing to accept any implication that the source might be internal or psychological. For the skeptics, the report was vindication. Those who had long suspected that the Taos hum was a case of mass suggestion or psychological contagion felt their views confirmed. No sound could be measured because there was no sound to measure. The phenomenon, they argued, existed only in the minds of the hearers, a collective delusion born from anxiety, suggestion, and the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. Some skeptics were gracious, acknowledging the sincere distress of the hearers even as they dismissed the objective reality of the hum. Others were less kind, resuming their earlier mockery with renewed confidence. But the most significant outcome of the 1993 investigation was not the conclusions it reached. It was the questions it left unanswered. The report had eliminated many possible explanations. It was not military equipment, not industrial noise, not a simple case of misidentified ambient sound. Yet, the hearers continued to hear. Their suffering did not diminish with the release of the report. The hum did not fade into silence just because instruments failed to capture it. If anything, the mystery deepened. What was causing these people such distress? Why did some hear it and others not? What mechanism could produce a consistent, localized phenomenon that defied scientific detection? The investigation became a turning point in the story of the Taos hum, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. Instead of resolving the mystery, it transformed it into something stranger and more troubling. The hearers were sincere. The hum was not detected. Both statements were true, and their coexistence created a paradox that resisted easy explanation. The phenomenon shifted from a straightforward acoustic mystery to something that touched on the limits of scientific measurement, the reliability of human perception, and the unsettling possibility that some experiences might exist in the gap between objective reality and subjective truth. In the years that followed, the 1993 investigation would be cited by both believers and skeptics as proof of their positions. But for those who lived through it, for the hearers who had pinned their hopes on validation and found instead only deeper questions, the legacy was more personal and more painful. They had trusted science to save them, and science had simply shrugged, unable to either confirm or cure their affliction. The hum continued its invisible work, and the people of Taos were left to live with a mystery that had now been officially declared unsolvable. The hum that haunts Taos is not alone in the world. Across continents and decades, similar low-frequency drones have emerged from the silence, troubling the sleep and sanity of those cursed to hear them. What many residents of Taos discovered in the late 1980s, was that their mysterious affliction had siblings, scattered across the globe like pieces of an acoustic puzzle that no one could quite solve. Bristol, England, became one of the first documented battlegrounds in this invisible war against sound. Beginning in the early 1970s, residents of this historic port city began reporting a persistent low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The Bristol hum, as it came to be known, affected neighborhoods throughout the city, but concentrated particularly in the suburb of Bishopston. Witnesses described it identically to how Taos residents would later characterize their experience: a diesel engine idling in the distance, a generator running just beyond perception, a sound that grew louder in the quiet of night and seemed to vibrate through walls and windows, as if the very foundations of their homes had become conduits for this phantom noise. What made Bristol particularly intriguing was its geographic and industrial profile. The city sits near the Bristol Channel, a major inlet of the Severn Estuary, with deep connections to maritime activity stretching back centuries. The presence of shipyards, power stations, and significant industrial infrastructure provided investigators with a buffet of potential culprits. Yet, despite extensive surveys conducted by the City Council and independent acoustic researchers throughout the 1970s and 80s, no definitive source could be identified. The hum persisted, affecting what local surveys estimated to be between 2 and 4% of the population, a figure that would become eerily consistent across other hum locations worldwide. Moving north to Scotland, the town of Largs presented another iteration of the phenomenon. This coastal town on the Firth of Clyde, with a population of roughly 11,000, began experiencing reports of a mysterious hum in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Largs hearers, as they came to call themselves, noted the same characteristics. The sound was more noticeable indoors than outdoors, more prevalent at night, and completely imperceptible to the majority of residents. The Largs hum gained enough notoriety that it attracted media attention and scientific investigation, but like Bristol before it, no smoking gun emerged. Researchers noted the town's proximity to the Holy Loch, which had served as a United States Navy base for Polaris submarines until 1992. The timing of the hum reports and the submarine presence raised questions about possible connections to military activities, though official investigations found no correlation. Halfway around the world, the Sydney suburb of Bondi became another focal point for hum reports, beginning in the early 1990s. Bondi, famous for its beach and coastal lifestyle, seemed an unlikely candidate for acoustic mystery. Yet residents in certain areas began reporting the familiar low-frequency drone, particularly noticeable in the quiet hours before dawn. The Bondi hum shared the frustrating elusiveness of its counterparts. Local authorities investigated potential sources, including sewage pumps, ventilation systems from the nearby Waverley Cemetery, and industrial facilities in the broader Sydney area. Environmental health officers conducted sound surveys, but conventional acoustic equipment often failed to register anything unusual in the frequency range where hearers insisted the hum resided. Once again, the percentage of affected residents hovered around 2 to 4% of the local population, suggesting either a consistent environmental factor or a consistent quirk of human perception. Windsor, Ontario, added a North American data point to the growing catalog of global hums. Beginning around 2011, residents of this Canadian city, directly across the Detroit River from Michigan, began reporting a pervasive rumbling sound that disrupted sleep and caused physical symptoms including headaches, dizziness, and vibrations felt throughout the body. The Windsor hum became one of the most intensively studied cases in recent decades, with both Canadian and American authorities investigating potential sources. The presence of heavy industry on both sides of the international border, including steel mills, power plants, and manufacturing facilities, provided numerous candidates. Researchers eventually identified a potential source on Zug Island, an industrial facility on the American side of the river, though complete resolution of the Windsor hum remained elusive even after mitigation efforts were implemented. These global cases established a pattern that researchers found both illuminating and puzzling. The hum phenomena tended to occur in geographically distinct areas, often coastal regions or locations with clear topographical boundaries. Many affected areas had significant military or industrial presence nearby, though not always. The consistency of the affected population percentage, that persistent 2 to 4% figure, suggested either a specific environmental trigger affecting a subset of sensitive individuals, or perhaps a physiological explanation rooted in how certain people process sound or electromagnetic information. The proposed explanations for these global hums have evolved over decades of investigation, each theory rising and falling on the strength of evidence and the persistence of the phenomena. Very low-frequency radio waves, particularly those used in submarine communications, emerged early as a compelling hypothesis. Military installations around the world have long used VLF transmissions to communicate with submarines at depth, broadcasting powerful signals in the range of 3 to 30 kHz. These signals can travel great distances and penetrate seawater, making them ideal for military communications, but also potential candidates for environmental acoustic phenomena. Some researchers theorize that certain individuals might be particularly sensitive to these transmissions, perhaps through a mechanism involving the inner ear or even dental fillings acting as receivers. However, comprehensive studies measuring VLF activity in hum-affected areas have not consistently correlated signal strength with hum reports, and the theory struggles to explain why hums persist in some locations even after documented changes in military communications infrastructure. Industrial equipment provided another avenue of investigation that seemed promising given the common presence of factories, power plants, and heavy machinery near hum locations. Large-scale industrial fans, compressors, turbines, and pumps can generate low-frequency vibrations that propagate through the ground and structures. These vibrations might be inaudible at their source, but could potentially manifest as audible hum at a distance through resonance effects or interaction with building structures. Investigators in Bristol, Windsor, and other locations conducted extensive surveys of industrial facilities, measuring sound emissions and correlating operating schedules with hum reports. While some industrial sources have been identified and mitigated in specific cases, the broader pattern of global hums has not yielded to an industrial explanation. The hums often persist when nearby factories are shut down, and they appear in locations with minimal industrial activity. Natural geological processes entered the theoretical landscape as researchers considered whether the Earth itself might generate these mysterious sounds. The concept of microseisms, continuous low-frequency vibrations of the ground caused by ocean waves, atmospheric pressure changes, or tectonic activity, offered a natural mechanism that could explain global distribution and coastal clustering. Some scientists propose that certain geological formations might amplify or focus these natural vibrations, creating localized zones where sensitive individuals could perceive them as audible hum. The theory gained support from observations that hum intensity sometimes varied with weather conditions and atmospheric pressure. However, seismic monitoring in hum-affected areas has not revealed consistent anomalies that would explain the specific characteristics of the hum or its selective audibility. Electromagnetic phenomena broaden the scope of investigation beyond conventional acoustics. Some researchers theorize that electromagnetic fields from power lines, electrical infrastructure, or natural sources might interact with human sensory systems in ways that produce the perception of sound without actual acoustic waves being present. This concept, sometimes called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, suggested that the hum might be a neurological interpretation of electromagnetic stimulation rather than a sound in the traditional sense. Studies have explored correlations between power grid operations and hum reports, with mixed results. The theory remains controversial in the scientific community, with skeptics noting the lack of a proven biological mechanism for translating electromagnetic fields into auditory sensations in the frequency ranges involved. Returning focus to Taos, the New Mexico location added its own unique variables to the global equation. The proximity of Los Alamos National Laboratory, birthplace of the atomic bomb and continuing center for classified research, inevitably sparked speculation about exotic technologies or secret experiments. Could advanced research into directed energy, underground facilities, or experimental communications systems be generating the hum as an unintended byproduct? The laboratory consistently denied any connection, and investigations found no measurable emissions from the facility that correlated with hum reports. Still, the presence of such a significant research installation added a layer of intrigue that locations like Bristol or Largs lack. Military installations near Taos provided another local angle for investigation. Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, approximately 70 miles south, and the White Sands Missile Range further south, raised questions about possible military contributions to the phenomena. Could underground facilities, radar installations, or testing activities generate vibrations or electromagnetic emissions that traveled north to the Taos area? Comprehensive studies by government agencies and independent researchers measured various forms of emissions and vibrations, but found nothing that adequately explained the hum's characteristics or distribution among the population. Some theories specific to Taos considered the unique geology of the Rio Grande Rift, the geological feature that created the valley system where Taos sits. Could the combination of fault lines, underground water flows, and the acoustic properties of the valley create conditions where natural vibrations became amplified or focused? Geological surveys mapped the subsurface structure, but revealed nothing obviously anomalous that would produce the described hum. The theory remained plausible but unproven. What makes certain theories more or less viable often comes down to what investigators have been able to rule out through direct measurement and correlation. Industrial sources have been partially excluded in many cases through the simple expedient of shutting down suspect facilities and observing whether the hum persists. In Windsor, this approach led to some progress, but in Taos and Bristol, the hum continued regardless of industrial operating schedules. VLF communications have been partially ruled out through measurements, showing that signal strength does not consistently correlate with hum perception, though proponents argue that sensitivity thresholds might vary among individuals in ways not captured by population-level studies. Geological explanations remain difficult to definitively exclude because the proposed mechanisms involve subtle effects that current monitoring technology might not adequately capture. The global pattern of hums, when viewed collectively, reveals both tantalizing similarities and frustrating inconsistencies. The consistency in affected population percentages suggests a real phenomenon with either environmental or physiological roots. The concentration in coastal or geographically distinct areas hints at topographical factors in propagation or amplification. The presence of military or industrial facilities nearby provides obvious suspects, yet the failure to consistently identify and eliminate sources suggests the explanation may be more subtle or more complex than a single industrial noise source. What remains plausible after decades of investigation is a more nuanced picture, where multiple factors might contribute to the hum experience. Perhaps certain geological conditions create a background of low-frequency vibrations that most people cannot perceive, but that become audible to sensitive individuals under specific atmospheric conditions. Perhaps industrial or military activities contribute intermittently, explaining variations in hum intensity without being the sole cause. Perhaps electromagnetic fields interact with individual biology in ways that science has not yet fully characterized, creating genuine perceptual experiences that conventional acoustic equipment cannot measure because they occur primarily in the neurological processing of those affected. Taos remains a primary case study in this global phenomenon, not because it was the first or the most severe, but because it combined elements that made it particularly suitable for intensive investigation. The relatively small population allowed for comprehensive surveys. The isolated location reduced background noise that might confound measurements. The confluence of potential sources, from Los Alamos to military installations to unique geology, made it a natural laboratory for testing multiple theories. And perhaps most importantly, the community of hearers in Taos organized and demanded answers with a persistence that kept the phenomenon in public consciousness and attracted ongoing scientific attention. The search for explanations continues, informed by each new report and each failed theory, building toward an understanding that may ultimately reveal something unexpected about how sound, vibration, electromagnetic fields, and human perception interact in ways our current models do not fully capture. In the high desert town of Taos, New Mexico, where the Rio Grande cuts through ancient volcanic rock and the air thins to almost 7,200 feet above sea level, some listeners of the mysterious hum began to ask questions that led them down darker pathways than simple scientific curiosity. These were questions about what lies beneath the surface of official explanations, about the nature of secrecy in a region shadowed by some of the most classified military installations in the United States, and about whether the persistent low-frequency drone that haunted their nights might be something far more deliberate than natural phenomenon or collective delusion. To understand why alternative theories about the Taos Hum gained such traction, you must first understand the landscape itself, both geographical and historical. Taos sits roughly 60 miles northeast of Los Alamos National Laboratory, birthplace of the atomic bomb, and still one of the most secretive research facilities in America. The town lies within 150 miles of White Sands Missile Range, Kirtland Air Force Base, and Sandia National Laboratories. This is a region where the Earth itself has been penetrated, tested, and transformed by government projects since the middle of the 20th century. The soil here is saturated with secrets, layer upon geological layer of classified experiments, underground facilities, and technologies that remain hidden from public view for decades after their development. During the Cold War, this corner of New Mexico became what some researchers have called an experimental frontier, a place where the usual rules governing civilian oversight and environmental protection were bent or broken in service of national security. Residents of the region lived for generations with the knowledge that things were happening beyond the fences and warning signs, things they were not permitted to know about, things that sometimes made the ground shake or lit up the night sky with unexplained flashes. This created a particular cultural atmosphere, a mixture of pride in contributing to national defense and unease about what exactly that contribution entailed. When the Taos Hum emerged as a documented phenomenon in the early 1990s, it entered this context of justified suspicion. For many residents and researchers drawn to alternative explanations, the proximity to classified facilities was not coincidental but causal. They began to construct theories that connected the mysterious sound to the hidden infrastructure of military research and development that honeycombed the Earth beneath the Southwest. One of the most persistent alternative theories centers on extremely low-frequency communication systems, or ELF technology. During the Cold War, the United States military developed methods of communicating with submarines at sea using radio waves at extraordinarily low frequencies, sometimes as low as 3 to 30 Hz. These waves can penetrate deep water and even solid rock, making them ideal for reaching vessels that needed to remain submerged and hidden. The infrastructure required for such systems is massive, involving antenna arrays that can stretch for miles and transmitters that pump enormous amounts of electromagnetic energy into the ground itself. Proponents of the ELF theory point out that such installations would be deeply classified and that their exact locations would never appear on public maps or in official documents available through Freedom of Information Act requests. They note that the frequency range of the Taos Hum, as reported by those who hear it, falls within the range that might be produced as an audible side effect of ELF transmission, particularly for individuals whose auditory systems are sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Some researchers have suggested that a small percentage of the population may possess a form of electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to perceive these transmissions as sound, even though the signals themselves operate below the normal threshold of human hearing. The government's response to such theories has been consistent denial. Military spokespeople and officials from various national laboratories have stated repeatedly that no ELF installations operate in the Taos area, that no classified projects in the region would produce the kind of sustained low-frequency emissions described by Hum hearers, and that the symptoms reported are more consistent with tinnitus or other medical conditions than with exposure to any form of directed energy or communication system. Yet these denials have done little to quiet the speculation, in part because the history of government secrecy in the region provides ample reason for skepticism. Residents of New Mexico and surrounding states have witnessed decades of official denials that later proved to be false. The plutonium experiments conducted on unknowing subjects, the radiation releases from Los Alamos that went unreported for years, the true nature of activities at Area 51 in Nevada, all of these eventually came to light despite categorical denials from authorities at the time they were occurring. Another theory that gained significant attention in the 1990s focused on the possibility of large-scale underground construction. This speculation suggested that the federal government was building deep underground facilities for various purposes, command and control centers that could survive nuclear attack, storage facilities for weapons or waste materials, or research laboratories conducting experiments too dangerous or controversial to perform on the surface. The process of excavating and constructing such facilities, according to this theory, would require massive boring machines that could generate sustained low-frequency vibrations transmitted through bedrock over considerable distances. Those who advocate for the underground construction theory point to documented evidence of similar projects in other locations. The Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository in Nevada, though eventually abandoned, involved years of tunneling and underground construction. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, built during the Cold War to house NORAD, required the excavation of millions of tons of granite. If such projects could be undertaken in those locations, the reasoning goes, why not in the geologically favorable terrain around Taos, where ancient volcanic formations provide both stability and natural shielding? The acoustic weapons theory represents perhaps the most controversial of the alternative explanations. This speculation suggests that military researchers might be testing devices designed to produce psychological or physiological effects through sound waves at frequencies below normal human hearing. Such weapons had been theorized since at least the 1960s based on the observation that exposure to certain low-frequency sounds could cause nausea, disorientation, anxiety, and other symptoms. The development of such technology would necessarily be classified, and testing would need to occur in areas with low population density, where effects on civilians could be monitored without widespread public awareness. Proponents of this theory note that the symptoms reported by Taos Hum hearers, insomnia, anxiety, headaches, and a sense of unease, closely match the predicted effects of infrasound exposure. They point to declassified documents showing military interest in acoustic weapons dating back to the Cold War, and to more recent reports of American diplomats in Cuba and China experiencing mysterious health effects that some researchers have attributed to directed energy or acoustic weapons. Could Taos have been a testing ground for similar technologies decades earlier? The scientific community has largely rejected these acoustic weapon theories, noting that the power requirements for producing sustained infrasound over a wide area would be prohibitive, and that no evidence exists of the kind of infrastructure such testing would require. Moreover, many acoustics experts argue that if military researchers wanted to test such devices, they would not do so in a populated area where civilians might detect and report the phenomena. The whole point of classified testing, according to this counterargument, is to avoid exactly the kind of public attention that the Taos Hum has generated. Yet for every expert dismissal, there are researchers and witnesses who remain unconvinced. They point out that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when dealing with classified programs designed specifically to leave no trace. They note that many military technologies, from stealth aircraft to various surveillance systems, operated for years or even decades before their existence was officially acknowledged. Why should acoustic research be any different? The persistence of these alternative theories reveals something significant about the relationship between citizens and institutions in late 20th and early 21st century America. The Taos Hum emerged at a particular moment in cultural history, just as the Cold War was ending and revelations about past government deceptions were becoming public knowledge. The 1990s saw the declassification of documents revealing the true extent of nuclear testing's health effects, the disclosure of unethical medical experiments, and growing awareness of environmental contamination at military sites across the country. This created a climate where trust in official explanations had eroded significantly, particularly in communities that had direct experience with the consequences of government secrecy. In Taos specifically, this mistrust had deep roots. The town and surrounding areas had been affected by the Los Alamos project since the 1940s, with workers and materials passing through on their way to the classified laboratory on the Pajarito Plateau. Residents had grown accustomed to seeing convoys marked only with numbers, to hearing explosions that were never explained, to watching aircraft that appeared on no commercial flight paths. The Hum, in this context, became another in a long series of unexplained phenomena associated with the hidden apparatus of military research. What these alternative theories share, beyond their focus on classified government activity, is a narrative structure that provides meaning and agency to an otherwise inexplicable experience. For those who hear the hum and find their lives disrupted by it, the idea that it might be a natural phenomenon or a quirk of individual neurology can feel inadequate or even insulting. It reduces their suffering to accident or personal defect. But if the hum is the result of deliberate human activity, even if that activity is secret and possibly harmful, then it becomes something that can potentially be opposed, investigated, or stopped. It transforms victims into witnesses, people who have stumbled upon something important that powerful institutions want to keep hidden. This psychological dynamic helps explain why alternative theories persist even in the face of scientific evidence suggesting other explanations. They provide not just answers, but a particular kind of answer that preserves the dignity and agency of those affected. They suggest that the hum hearers are not suffering from delusions, but are instead perceiving something real that others, for various reasons, cannot or will not acknowledge. The question of what these theories reveal about contemporary society extends beyond the specific case of the Taos Hum. They reflect a broader crisis of authority and expertise, a widespread sense that official explanations cannot be trusted, that institutions designed to protect public welfare may instead be concealing threats to it. Whether or not any of the specific alternative theories about the Taos Hum prove to be accurate, they function as cultural documents, evidence of a fractured relationship between citizens and the state, between lived experience and official narrative. And so the mystery deepens, not just as a question of acoustics or neurology, but as a question of what we can know and who gets to decide what counts as knowledge. Beneath the official denials and the scientific skepticism, beneath the measurements and the studies, there remains an unresolved tension, a persistent doubt that refuses to be quieted by reassurance or explanation. The human ear is a marvel of biological engineering, but it is also a potential source of profound deception. To understand why some people hear the hum, while others remain blissfully unaware of its existence, we must first venture into the labyrinth of human auditory perception, where the line between external reality and internal experience becomes remarkably thin. Inside each human ear, deep within the coiled chambers of the cochlea, approximately 15,000 hair cells stand like microscopic sentinels, waiting to translate vibrations in the air into electrical signals that the brain can interpret as sound. These hair cells are arranged with extraordinary precision, each one tuned to respond to specific frequencies, from the deepest bass rumble to the highest pitched whistle. But here's where the story becomes fascinating and somewhat unsettling. These hair cells don't merely receive sound passively. They also produce it. This phenomenon is known as oacoustic emissions, and it represents one of the most counterintuitive discoveries in modern audiology. The hair cells in your cochlea actually generate their own acoustic energy, producing faint sounds that can be measured with sensitive microphones placed in the ear canal. These emissions occur in nearly everyone with normal hearing, though most people remain completely unaware of them. The sounds generated by your own ears typically fall below the threshold of conscious perception, drowned out by environmental noise, and filtered away by your brain's remarkable ability to ignore irrelevant stimuli. But what happens when this filtering system breaks down, or when someone possesses an unusually acute awareness of their own auditory system? Dr. Patricia Henderson, an audiologist who has spent more than 2 decades studying unexplained auditory phenomena, describes what she calls the threshold of internal awareness. In her Boston clinic, she has examined hundreds of patients who complain of persistent sounds that no one else can hear. She explains that the boundary between what we consider external sound and internal sensation is far more permeable than most people realize. When Dr. Henderson places a patient in a soundproof chamber, a room where external noise is reduced to virtually nothing, something remarkable happens. After just a few minutes, nearly everyone begins to hear things. Some describe a high-pitched ringing. Others report a low, pulsing hum. A few hear what sounds like rushing water or distant machinery. These are the sounds of your own body, the normally imperceptible orchestra of biological processes that continue whether you're aware of them or not. Blood flowing through vessels near the ear. Muscles contracting in the middle ear. The random firing of auditory neurons, the oacoustic emissions generated by those hair cells in the cochlea. For most people, stepping out of the soundproof chamber means these internal sounds fade back into obscurity, masked by the ambient noise of daily life. But for some individuals, the awareness persists. They have, in effect, learned to hear the symphony of their own nervous system, and they cannot unlearn it. This brings us to tinnitus, perhaps the most common form of phantom sound perception. Approximately 15 to 20% of adults experience some form of tinnitus, though only about 5% find it severely distressing. Tinnitus is often described as a ringing in the ears, but the manifestations vary wildly. Some people hear buzzing, clicking, hissing, or humming. The sounds can be high or low, constant or intermittent, located in one ear or both, or seemingly emanating from inside the head itself. The mechanisms underlying tinnitus are complex and still not fully understood, but research over the past 2 decades has revealed that the phenomenon originates not in the ear itself, but in the brain. When hair cells in the cochlea become damaged, whether through aging, noise exposure, or disease, they stop sending their normal patterns of electrical signals to the auditory cortex. In response, neurons in the brain appear to increase their sensitivity, turning up their gain in an attempt to detect signals that are no longer arriving. This increased neural activity is interpreted as sound, even though no external acoustic stimulus exists. Dr. Michael Chen, a neurologist specializing in auditory processing disorders, describes this as the brain generating noise to fill the silence. He has used functional magnetic resonance imaging to observe the brains of tinnitus patients, and has found increased activity in auditory processing regions even when no sound is present. The brain, he explains, abhors silence the way nature abhors a vacuum. When expected input fails to arrive, the neural networks create their own. What makes certain cases of tinnitus particularly relevant to understanding the hum phenomenon is the characteristic of the sound that patients report. While many experience high-frequency ringing, a significant subset describes low-frequency sounds, rumbling, throbbing, or humming, that seems to come from outside rather than inside their heads. These patients often engage in extensive searching behavior, convinced that they must be hearing a real environmental source. They check their appliances, investigate their heating systems, and question their neighbors, searching for a source that may not exist outside their own auditory processing. But the story doesn't end with tinnitus. Another condition, less well-known but equally relevant, is hyperacusis. People with hyperacusis experience ordinary environmental sounds as intolerably loud. A conversation at normal volume becomes overwhelming. The sound of dishes clattering or paper rustling can be physically painful. This heightened sensitivity stems from changes in how the brain processes auditory information, essentially an over-amplification of incoming signals. Dr. Henderson has observed that hyperacusis and selective frequency sensitivity often go hand in hand. Some of her patients demonstrate normal hearing thresholds at most frequencies, but show remarkable sensitivity to specific narrow bands of sound. One patient could detect a 50 Hz tone at levels more than 20 decibels below what typical listeners required. Another showed extraordinary sensitivity to sounds between 80 and 100 Hz, the exact frequency range most commonly associated with the hum. This brings us to a crucial question. Could some people possess genuine physiological differences that allow them to detect real environmental sounds that most people cannot perceive? The answer appears to be yes, though with important caveats. Human hearing is typically described as ranging from 20 to 20,000 Hz, but these boundaries are not absolute. They represent statistical averages, not universal limits. Individual variation in hearing sensitivity is substantial, and some people can detect sounds slightly below or above the standard range. Low-frequency hearing, in particular, shows considerable variation. Sounds below 20 Hz, classified as infrasound, are generally considered inaudible, but studies have shown that some individuals can perceive infrasonic tones down to 12 or even 8 Hz under the right conditions, though they may not recognize them as sound in the traditional sense. Dr. Sarah Novak, a researcher who has studied individual differences in low-frequency perception, explains that sensitivity to these deep sounds often manifests not as hearing in the conventional sense but as physical sensation. Test subjects describe feeling pressure in their chest or ears, experiencing vibration in their bodies, or sensing a presence that they cannot quite define. The boundary between hearing and feeling becomes blurred at these extremely low frequencies. This raises a provocative possibility. Our modern environment is filled with low-frequency sounds that our ancestors never encountered. Electrical transformers emit a constant 60 Hz hum in countries with 60 Hz electrical systems, or 50 Hz in regions using that standard. Industrial facilities produce complex, low-frequency noise. Wind turbines generate infrasound. Ventilation systems in large buildings create acoustic environments that would have been unimaginable a century ago. Even the Earth itself produces low-frequency seismic noise, a constant background of microseisms caused by ocean waves, wind, and geological processes. Most people remain completely unaware of this acoustic environment because their brains filter it out, categorizing it as irrelevant background information that doesn't require conscious attention. But what if some individuals lack this filtering ability or possess heightened sensitivity to these specific frequencies? They would exist in a world where they are constantly aware of sounds that others simply do not perceive, not because the sounds don't exist, but because most brains have learned to ignore them. Dr. Chen describes this as selective attention failure. The human brain, he explains, is bombarded with far more sensory information than it can possibly process consciously. We see, hear, feel, smell, and taste thousands of stimuli every moment, but we are aware of only a tiny fraction. The brain constantly makes decisions about what to bring into conscious awareness and what to filter away. This filtering is not random. It's based on learned patterns, emotional significance, and current goals. A mother will wake instantly to her baby's cry while sleeping through louder traffic noise. A musician will notice a slightly out-of-tune instrument that others don't detect. For reasons that remain unclear, some people appear to lose the ability to filter out certain persistent, low-frequency sounds. Once these sounds enter conscious awareness, they can become impossible to ignore. The person becomes hypervigilant, constantly monitoring for the sound, which paradoxically makes it more salient and harder to filter away. A feedback loop develops where attention to the sound strengthens neural pathways associated with detecting it, making it progressively more prominent in conscious experience. This creates a genuinely tragic situation. The person is not imagining the sound. They are genuinely experiencing it, and their distress is real and valid. But the source may be a combination of real environmental noise that most people unconsciously ignore and their own brain's inability to filter that noise away. They are trapped between those who insist the sound must have an external source that can be found and eliminated, and those who dismiss their experience as purely psychological, as if psychological somehow means not real or not worthy of concern. Dr. Ray Henderson emphasizes that validating the experience while understanding its mechanisms is crucial for helping sufferers find relief. Whether a sound originates from an external source or from the interaction between real environmental stimuli and individual neurological processing patterns, the suffering it causes is equally genuine. The goal should not be to prove or disprove the existence of an external hum, but to understand why certain individuals experience persistent sounds and how they might find relief. Treatment approaches that show promise often focus not on eliminating the sound, which may be impossible, but on reducing the brain's reaction to it. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help break the cycle of attention and distress. Sound enrichment, introducing other sounds to mask or compete with the troublesome frequency, sometimes provides relief. In some cases, simply understanding the mechanisms involved reduces anxiety and allows the brain's filtering systems to gradually reassert themselves. The human auditory system, it turns out, is far more complex and individual than simple models suggest. Each person inhabits a slightly different acoustic world, shaped by the unique characteristics of their ears, the specific pattern of neural connections in their brain, and their learned patterns of attention and filtering. The hum phenomenon, viewed through this lens, becomes less a mystery to be solved and more a window into the profound variations in human perception and the sometimes troubling spaces where objective reality and subjective experience diverge. The sound begins at night. For those who hear it, The hum announces itself in the quiet hours when the world has settled into darkness. At first, it seems like nothing more than a minor irritation, a low-frequency drone that pulses at the edge of perception. But as the nights accumulate, as sleep becomes elusive and then impossible, something inside begins to break. Imagine lying in bed, your partner breathing softly beside you, while your head fills with a relentless vibration that no one else can detect. You press your hands against your ears, but the sound seems to come from inside your skull. You move from room to room, searching for relief that never arrives. Night after night, you watch the ceiling while exhaustion settles into your bones, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, your grip on wellness begins to loosen. This is the reality for thousands of people who experience what has come to be known as the hum, and the psychological toll of this phenomenon extends far beyond simple annoyance. Sleep deprivation becomes the first domino in a cascade of suffering that can reshape entire lives. Medical science has long understood that chronic sleep loss creates profound changes in brain chemistry. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation and rational thinking, begins to falter. Anxiety blooms in the absence of rest. Depression follows closely behind. But for those who hear the hum, these clinical descriptions fail to capture the lived experience of deterioration, the feeling of sanity slipping away one sleepless hour at a time. The psychological damage intensifies because of a cruel paradox at the heart of the hum experience. The suffering is invisible. When your partner wakes beside you, asking why you are wandering the house at 3 a.m, how do you explain a sound they cannot hear? When you tell your doctor about the persistent drone that is destroying your ability to function, and they find nothing wrong with your hearing, what then? The hum creates a unique form of torment because it lacks external validation. You cannot point to a wound. You cannot produce evidence. You have only your own testimony, and as the weeks stretch into months, even you begin to wonder about the reliability of your own perceptions. Social isolation becomes inevitable. Friends grow tired of hearing about your mysterious affliction. Family members suggest, gently at first, and then with increasing frustration, that perhaps you are stressed, that maybe you should see someone, that you might be imagining things. The phrase, "it is all in your head," becomes a familiar refrain, and while it is meant to dismiss, there is an accidental truth to it. The sound is in your head, inescapable and constant, but this does not make it any less real to the person experiencing it. Marriages fracture under the strain. One woman from Bristol described how the hum created an invisible wall between her and her husband of 23 years. She would rage at him for running the dishwasher, for leaving the heating on, for any mechanical hum that might be contributing to her torment. He could not understand her desperation because he lived in silence. Eventually, he began sleeping in the spare room. Then he began staying with friends on weekends. The hum had not just invaded her head, it had invaded the space between them, filling it with frustration and incomprehension until there was no room left for connection. Children watch their parents deteriorate and cannot understand why. A man from New Mexico recounted how his teenage daughter stopped bringing friends home because she was embarrassed by his behavior, by the foam padding he had installed on every wall, by his middle-of-the-night patrols through the house with recording equipment, searching for the source of a sound no one else could detect. He saw the shame in her eyes, and it compounded his anguish. The hum was not just stealing his sleep, it was stealing his relationship with his child. In extreme cases, the psychological pressure becomes unbearable. There are documented instances of people who, after years of torment, have contemplated or attempted suicide. The desperation becomes that complete. When sleep is impossible, when no one believes you, when every authority figure you consult offers no relief and subtle implications that you might be mentally unstable, the future can seem impossibly bleak. Some choose a different escape and relocate entirely, abandoning homes and communities in search of silence. They drive for hours or days, testing different locations, listening desperately for the absence of the drone. Some find relief. Others discover that the hum follows them, which raises the terrifying possibility that the source might be internal, might be something fundamentally broken inside their own perception. The trauma of being doubted or dismissed by medical professionals deserves particular attention because it represents a betrayal of the fundamental promise of healthcare. When you visit a doctor, you bring your suffering, and trust that it will be taken seriously. But the hum presents no clear pathology, no objective measurement that shows up on tests. Audiologists conduct hearing exams that reveal nothing unusual. Brain scans show no abnormalities. The sufferer leaves the office with no diagnosis, no treatment plan, and often with the lingering sense that they have been categorized as a psychiatric case rather than someone with a legitimate physical complaint. This medical dismissal creates secondary trauma, a wound inflicted not by the hum itself but by the response to it. One woman from Scotland described visiting 7 different doctors over the course of 2 years. Each one performed perfunctory examinations and suggested stress management techniques or antidepressants. Not one acknowledged the possibility that she might be experiencing a real acoustic phenomenon. The message she received again and again was that the problem was not environmental, but psychological. Not something happening to her, but something she was creating. This distinction matters enormously to those who suffer. It is the difference between being a victim of circumstance and being the author of your own torment. Yet, within this landscape of isolation and dismissal, communities of validation have emerged. Online forums dedicated to the hum have become lifelines for thousands of sufferers. In these digital spaces, people find what they cannot find in their physical lives. Others who hear what they hear, who understand the specific quality of the sound, who do not question or doubt. These forums fill with detailed descriptions, with maps marking locations where the hum is reported, with theories and coping strategies. The emotional relief of finding these communities cannot be overstated. After months or years of being told that you are alone in your experience, discovering hundreds or thousands of others who share it can feel like salvation. Support groups, both online and occasionally in person, provide more than just validation. They create a framework for understanding the experience, a shared language that helps people make sense of their suffering. Members compare notes on the frequency and timing of the hum, on what makes it better or worse, on strategies that have brought even temporary relief. Some have found that white noise machines help. Others sleep with fans running, or have relocated their bedrooms to different parts of the house. The specific solutions matter less than the act of sharing them, the collective problem solving that makes individuals feel less powerless. But these communities also introduce a complex psychological dimension that cannot be ignored. The nocebo effect, the evil twin of the placebo effect, describes how negative expectations can create or worsen physical symptoms. When someone who has just begun to hear a strange sound at night discovers an online forum filled with people describing years of torment, sleepless nights, and ruined lives, what happens to their experience? Does the anxiety about the sound amplify their perception of it? Does reading about others' suffering create a template for their own deterioration? Research into the nocebo effect suggests that this feedback loop is not only possible, but likely. The brain is remarkably suggestible, particularly when it comes to ambiguous sensory input. A low-frequency sound that might initially be a mild irritation can become unbearable when coupled with the fear that it will destroy your sleep, your relationships, your mental health. The anxiety itself can heighten sensory perception, making you more attuned to the very sound you desperately wish to ignore. This creates a vicious cycle. The sound causes anxiety. The anxiety amplifies the perception of the sound. The amplified perception increases anxiety, and so on, until the sufferer is trapped in a spiral of their own heightened awareness. This possibility raises uncomfortable questions for those who suffer from the hum, and for those who seek to help them. If some portion of the distress is created or amplified by anxiety, does that make the suffering less real? Does it mean the sound is imaginary? These questions reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of how psychological and physical phenomena interact. The distinction between a sound that exists in the environment and one that exists only in perception may matter for identifying solutions, but it does not diminish the reality of the suffering. Pain is pain regardless of its source. This brings us to perhaps the most important ethical question surrounding the hum. Does it matter whether the sound is objectively real when the suffering is undeniably genuine? From a purely philosophical standpoint, we might argue about the nature of reality and perception. But from a humane standpoint, the answer must be no doubt. When someone is in distress, when their quality of life has deteriorated, when they are losing sleep and relationships and hope, The proper response is not to debate the objective reality of their experience, but to acknowledge their suffering and seek ways to alleviate. Yet, this is precisely where the medical and social response to the hum so often fails. By focusing on whether the sound is real, by ordering tests and conducting studies to verify its existence, we miss the more immediate truth. The people experiencing it are in crisis. They need support regardless of whether we can measure the sound with instruments. They need validation regardless of whether others can hear it. They need solutions regardless of whether the source is environmental or neurological. The emotional peak of the hum phenomenon is not found in scientific data or acoustic measurements. It is found in the lived experience of those who suffer, in the accumulation of sleepless nights and dismissive doctors and strained relationships. It is found in the moment when someone discovers they are not alone, that others hear what they hear, that their sanity is intact even as their world has become unbearable. It is found in the resilience required to continue seeking answers when every authority has offered none, to continue hoping for relief when none has come. The human capacity for suffering is vast, but so too is the capacity for endurance. Those who hear the hum and continue to function, who maintain their relationships despite the strain, who search for solutions despite repeated failures, demonstrate a profound strength. Their struggle reveals something essential about the human condition, that we can bear almost anything except being truly alone in our suffering. And that validation, the simple acknowledgement that what we experience is real to us, can be as powerful as any cure. The high desert air is cool this morning as the sun climbs over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sage and chamisa in shades of copper and gold. Taos looks much the same as it did 30 years ago when the hum first entered public consciousness. The adobe buildings still clustered against the mountainside, the vast plateau stretching westward toward the Rio Grande Gorge. But if you know where to look, you can see the changes time has wrought on this small community that became, for a brief moment in the early 1990s, the center of a mystery that captivated the world. Katie Stone still lives in her house on the edge of town, the same house where she first heard the hum in 1991. She is older now, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes still carry that particular quality shared by all long-term hearers, a look that speaks of sleepless nights and a burden others cannot see. The hum never left her, she says, though she has learned to live with it in ways she could not have imagined during those first terrible months. Some nights are worse than others. Some seasons bring relief. But it is always there, waiting in the quiet moments, a companion she never wanted and cannot dismiss. Over the decades, Katie has become something of an ambassador for the hearers, someone who speaks calmly and thoughtfully about an experience that defies calm and thoughtful description. She has learned which doctors will listen and which will not, which friends can be trusted with the truth, and which grow uncomfortable when the subject arises. She has developed her own methods of coping, a combination of white noise machines, meditation, and the simple acceptance that some questions may never be answered. This acceptance did not come easily, she admits, and there are still moments when the frustration returns, when she finds herself wondering why her nervous system perceives something others cannot hear, why her reality diverges so fundamentally. The community itself has moved on in the way communities do, the initial flurry of attention fading into local lore. The younger residents often know nothing of the hum investigations, while older Taoseños remember it with a mixture of curiosity and mild embarrassment, as if the town's moment in the spotlight revealed something they would have preferred to keep private. Yet the hearers remain, scattered throughout the valley, most of them silent now about their experience, having learned that speaking up brings sympathy at best and skepticism at worst. What did we learn from all those investigations, from the sound engineers and the scientists, from the endless speculation and the careful measurements? We learned that mystery can persist even in an age of sophisticated technology. We learned that human perception operates in ranges and registers that instruments cannot always capture. We learned that the absence of measurable sound does not mean the absence of genuine suffering. Perhaps most importantly, we learned something about the nature of belief itself, about what it means to trust someone's experience even when we cannot verify it through our own senses. The Taos Hum investigations revealed the limits of scientific inquiry when confronted with subjective phenomena. Science demands reproducibility, measurable data, evidence that can be independently verified. But what happens when the phenomenon exists only for some, when the very act of perception becomes the mystery? The researchers did not fail in their mission. They simply encountered a boundary that current methodology cannot cross. Their honesty in admitting this, in acknowledging that they could neither prove nor disprove the hearer's experiences, represents a kind of intellectual humility that serves us better than false certainty ever could. And yet, the investigations mattered deeply. They mattered because they told the hearers that their experience was worthy of serious attention, that they were not simply dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking. They mattered because they established baseline data that might, someday, contribute to a fuller understanding. They mattered because they demonstrated that science, at its best, is willing to engage with phenomena that resist easy categorization, to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to premature conclusion. The Taos Hum teaches us something profound about invisible disabilities, about all those conditions that cannot be seen or measured by outside observers yet cause genuine suffering to those who experience them. How many people live with tinnitus, with chronic pain, with neurological conditions that manifest only in subjective symptoms? How often are they doubted, dismissed, told that their suffering is not real because it cannot be quantified? The hearers of Taos became, inadvertently, representatives of everyone who has ever been told that their pain exists only in their imagination, everyone who has sought help for something others cannot perceive. This raises deeper questions about the nature of reality itself. We tend to assume that reality is objective, that what exists does so independently of our perception. But consciousness complicates this tidy model. If a sound is heard, but cannot be recorded, does it exist? If a person suffers but shows no outward signs, is their suffering real? The hearers answer yes to both questions, insisting on the validity of their experience, even in the absence of external confirmation. They remind us that subjective experience is, in fact, the only kind of experience any of us ever have. We live inside our own perceptions, trusting that they align with some shared external reality, but we can never step outside our own consciousness to verify this alignment. The human need for explanation runs deep in our species. We are pattern-seeking creatures, storytellers who crave narrative coherence. When something happens that defies explanation, we feel genuine distress, a kind of cognitive dissonance that demands resolution. The hearers wanted an explanation desperately, something that would make sense of their experience, transform it from meaningless suffering into a problem with a solution. Many of them would have preferred almost any answer to no answer at all. At least an identified source could be addressed, mitigated, stopped. But some mysteries resist our demand for closure, and learning to live with this uncertainty requires a different kind of strength. Validation, too, emerges as a fundamental human need revealed by this story. The hearers did not simply want the hum to stop. They wanted others to acknowledge that it was real, that they were not imagining their torment. This need for validation speaks to our social nature, to the way we construct our sense of reality through shared experience. When our experience diverges radically from those around us, we feel isolated in a particularly profound way. The hearers found solace, not in scientific proof, which never materialized, but in finding each other, in discovering that they were not alone in their perception. This community of experience provided its own form of validation, one that did not depend on external verification. Standing now in the vast quiet of the Taos desert, you can feel the weight of all that empty space, the way sound behaves differently here than in cluttered, noisy cities. The wind moves through the sage with a whisper that might be nothing or might be everything. The land holds its secrets close. Somewhere in these valleys and mesas, some people hear something others do not, and this divergence in perception has created a small crack in our shared reality, revealing depths we rarely examine. The mysteries that persist at the edges of human experience are not failures of science or imagination. They are reminders of how much remains unknown, how many questions we have not yet learned to properly ask. They humble us, these unexplained phenomena, forcing us to acknowledge that our understanding of consciousness, perception, and reality itself remains incomplete. The Taos Hum is one such mystery among many, a phenomenon that refuses to be neatly categorized or definitively solved. And the people who live with these unexplained experiences demonstrate a remarkable resilience. They adapt, they cope, they find ways to continue living full lives despite carrying burdens others cannot see or share. Their strength lies not in conquering the mystery, but in accommodating it, in making space for uncertainty within their daily existence. They show us that it is possible to live without answers, to endure suffering that has no clear cause or cure, to maintain dignity and hope even when validation remains elusive. As the sun climbs higher over Taos, the shadows shorten and the day grows warm. The hum continues, for those who hear it, as constant and inexplicable as ever. Science may yet discover its source, or it may remain forever at the boundary of what we can measure and understand. Either way, the hearers will persist, carrying their invisible burden with grace and courage, asking not that we share their experience, but simply that we believe them when they describe it. This is what the Taos Hum ultimately teaches us, that empathy does not require verification, that believing someone's pain does not depend on our ability to measure it, and that sometimes the most honest answer is to acknowledge what we do not know while standing in solidarity with those who suffer nonetheless. The desert holds its silence, broken only by wind and the mysteries we cannot name. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on